Ilnor, the Torvani medic, had seen countless injuries in his service aboard the starship Valtharis. He had treated species with exoskeletons that cracked under pressure, beings that dissolved into puddles if pierced, and creatures whose blood was a gaseous plume that needed containment. But nothing had prepared him for the sight of Jace Warner, the human engineer, lying on the medbay table. The injury was grotesque. A jagged shard of metal protruded from Jace's side, coated in a mix of crimson blood and oily residue from the ship's coolant system. The man was pale, his breathing shallow, and his body trembled with the effort of holding on. "By the stars," Ilnor murmured, activating the sterilization field around the table. The translucent membranes of his thoracic flaps quivered, a subconscious display of his unease. "You should not be alive." Jace coughed weakly, blood flecking his lips. "I'm not dead yet." His voice was barely a whisper, but the stubborn determination in it made Ilnor pause. "Your condition is critical," Ilnor said, his four hands moving swiftly to prepare the surgical tools. A nearby monitor displayed Jace's vitals in unsettling detail: heart rate spiking erratically, blood pressure plummeting, oxygen saturation dangerously low. "You have lost a significant volume of blood. The shard is compromising several vital organs. Immediate intervention is required." "Then, get to it," Jace rasped, his lips pulling into the faintest ghost of a smirk before he winced in pain. "Do not attempt to speak further," Ilnor said, his voice sterner now. He injected a dose of broad-spectrum hemostatic nanites into Jace's bloodstream, hoping they would buy him enough time to stabilize the human. "Your physiology is fragile enough without your reckless insistence on wasting energy." Jace tried to respond but grimaced instead, his teeth gritted against the pain. Ilnor's secondary hands activated the auto-suture array, while his primaries maneuvered a delicate extraction tool. The shard, nearly 20 centimeters long, had entered just below Jace's ribcage, narrowly missing the liver but slicing through the abdominal wall. The medic took a deep breath, focusing entirely on the task. "Extraction will be slow to avoid further tearing. You must remain absolutely still." "Wasn't planning on moving," Jace muttered, his voice slurred. Ilnor's thoracic flaps vibrated in frustration. "You should not even be conscious. Your species' tolerance for pain is unnatural." The medic began the extraction, carefully sliding the shard out millimeter by millimeter. Each movement caused fresh bleeding, and the auto-suture array worked frantically to close the wounds in its wake. Jace's body jerked involuntarily as the shard dislodged from a particularly sensitive nerve cluster. His breathing turned ragged, and his eyes fluttered. "Stay with me," Ilnor said sharply, his hands never pausing. "If you lose consciousness now, your heart may not restart." "Not going anywhere," Jace slurred, though his face was ashen and beads of sweat rolled down his temples. With a final, careful pull, Ilnor removed the shard and immediately sealed the entry and exit wounds with a sterile polymer gel. He activated the tissue regenerator, watching intently as the device began knitting the torn layers of muscle and skin. "You are extraordinarily lucky," Ilnor said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Any other species would have perished from the initial injury." Lucky. Jace's eyes fluttered open, his gaze glassy but defiant. "Feels like hell." "Pain is preferable to death," Ilnor replied curtly. He injected a measured dose of synthetic blood plasma to counteract the severe hypovolemia, followed by a cocktail of electrolytes and glucose to stabilize Jace's dwindling energy reserves. Jace let out a shaky breath, his head lolling to the side. "You're the expert." The medic frowned. "Hardly. Your physiology defies conventional medical understanding. Your body's fragility is matched only by its inexplicable tenacity." Jace didn't answer, his consciousness slipping away. Ilnor worked tirelessly over the next several hours, monitoring Jace's vitals and making minute adjustments to ensure the human's recovery remained on track. He synthesized additional clotting agents to prevent internal bleeding, reinforced the polymer sealant with a micro-lattice scaffold for added durability, and used advanced imaging to ensure no residual damage had gone unnoticed. Finally, as the diagnostic displays showed relative stability, Ilnor allowed himself a moment to observe his patient. Jace's breathing was shallow but steady, his color returning to something closer to normal. "I do not understand your kind," Ilnor murmured to himself. fragile, and yet. He trailed off, shaking his head. For now, Jace Warner lived. But Ilnor could not shake the feeling that this human survival defied more than medical logic. It challenged the very laws of nature. Jace woke again to an oppressive heaviness pressing on his chest and a sharp, gnawing pain radiating from his side. His eyes opened slowly, squinting against the sterile white glow of the medbay lights. He tried to take a deep breath but stopped mid-inhale, wincing as the pain flared. "Do not attempt to breathe deeply," Ilnor's voice said from somewhere nearby. The alien medic stepped into Jace's field of vision, his tall, angular frame casting a faint shadow over the bed. "Your diaphragm is still healing. Overextension will strain the sutures." Jace blinked up at him, the medic's words slow to process through the haze of discomfort. "How long was I out?" 11 planetary hours, Ilnor said, his tone neutral. His 4 hands worked in synchrony to adjust the nutrient infusion line connected to Jace's arm. "You are stable, though far from recovered." "Feels like I've been hit by a star freighter," Jace muttered, trying to shift into a more comfortable position. The effort sent a spike of pain shooting through his side, and he sucked in a sharp breath. "Cease movement," Ilnor said sternly, placing a restraining hand on Jace's shoulder. "Your injury was extensive. Despite my best efforts, your body remains in a precarious state." Jace frowned. "I'm alive though, right?" "For now," Ilnor said, his tone clipped. The human exhaled slowly, his brow furrowing. "Not exactly comforting, Doc." "Comfort is irrelevant," Ilnor replied, his iridescent eyes narrowing. "Your survival, however improbable, is the result of precise medical intervention and an apparent, though unquantifiable, resilience unique to your species. I am not in the habit of indulging in sentimentality." Jace tried to muster a retort, but was interrupted by a sharp beeping from one of the monitors. Ilnor moved quickly to the console, his thoracic flaps fluttering in agitation. "What is it?" Jace asked, his voice hoarse. "Your blood pressure is fluctuating," Ilnor said, his hands flying over the controls. "Your circulatory system remains dangerously unstable. I must recalibrate the plasma infusions." The medic worked in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the hum of machinery and the rhythmic beep of the monitors. Jace watched him, his head too heavy to lift, but his eyes sharp with curiosity. "Ilnor," Jace said finally, his voice soft. The medic glanced at him briefly. "What is it?" "You said something earlier. About my body being fragile. Why do you keep saying that?" Ilnor hesitated, his hands pausing mid-motion. He turned to face Jace fully, his expression unreadable. "Because it is the truth. Your musculature, your skeletal structure, your single set of vital organs, they are all inferior in durability to those of most known species. By Torvani standards, your body is a collection of vulnerabilities barely held together by organic happenstance." "Thanks for the pep talk," Jace said dryly, though his lips twitched into a faint smirk. Ilnor ignored the comment. And yet he continued, his tone shifting to something almost contemplative. "You persist. Despite your biological limitations, you endure injuries that should be fatal. You exhibit a level of determination, no defiance, that is entirely illogical." Jace tilted his head slightly, considering the medic's words. "We're not fragile," he said after a moment. "We just have to work harder to survive." Ilnor's thoracic flaps quivered. "Explain." "Humans don't have armored exoskeletons or redundant organs," Jace said, his voice steady despite the pain in his side. "We don't regenerate lost limbs or heal overnight. But we adapt, we learn, we push through because giving up isn't an option. Fragile doesn't mean weak." The medic stared at him, his iridescent eyes flickering in thought. "Adaptation," he repeated slowly. "An inefficient but intriguing survival mechanism." Jace smiled faintly. "Call it what you want, but it works." Before Ilnor could respond, the door to the med bay slid open, and Captain Rena entered, her stride purposeful. She stopped at Jace's bedside, her antennae twitching as she took in his pale complexion and the bandages wrapped tightly around his torso. "How's he doing?" she asked, addressing Ilnor. "Alive," the medic replied curtly. "For now." "That's reassuring," Rena said dryly, her gaze shifting to Jace. "You look like hell, Warner. Feel worse, Jace muttered. Rena crossed her arms, her expression softening slightly. I've seen a lot of close calls in my time, but this one, you're lucky to be here. Lucky, Ilnor interjected, his voice sharp, is an inadequate term. His survival defies all statistical probability. Not the first time, Jace said, his tone grim. Rena raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Before I joined the crew, I worked in orbital construction, Jace explained, his voice growing quieter. There was an accident, a pressure seal failed during a maintenance check. I got caught in the decompression wave. Rena's eyes widened slightly. And you lived. Barely, Jace said. Broke a dozen bones, tore up half my insides. Spent 6 months in a rehab unit learning to walk again, he glanced at Ilnor. Guess this isn't my first rodeo with beating the odds. The medic's thoracic flaps quivered again, though he said nothing. Rena nodded slowly. Well, let's hope it's the last. You're too damn stubborn to keep dancing that close to death. Not planning on making a habit of it, Jace said with a faint smile. Rena patted his shoulder gently. Get some rest, Warner. That's an order. As she left, Ilnor turned back to Jace, his expression unreadable. You have faced death before, he said slowly. Jace nodded. More than once. And each time, you survived through sheer force of will. Call it what you want, Jace said. I just call it being human. Ilnor regarded him for a long moment, his iridescent eyes flickering. Then, without a word, he returned to his work, the faint hum of the medical equipment filling the silence. Jace's recovery was slow, each moment marked by a dull ache in his side and a constant, oppressive fatigue that weighed down his limbs. Ilnor remained a near-constant presence, monitoring his vitals with tireless precision. Despite the alien medic's brusque manner, Jace had grown oddly comfortable with his presence. The days blurred together. Nutrient infusions replaced meals, and the cold, sterile hum of the med bay became Jace's entire world. The only reprieve came in brief visits from the crew, their faces flickering between concern and cautious optimism. On the 4th day, Jace awoke to find Ilnor standing at the central console, reviewing what appeared to be holographic schematics of a human circulatory system. The alien's expression, though unreadable, suggested deep focus. Morning, Doc, Jace croaked, his voice rough from disuse. Ilnor turned, his iridescent eyes narrowing slightly. Your circadian rhythm is inconsequential here, he said, though his tone lacked its usual edge. How do you feel? Like I got gutted by a feral Kurthak, Jace muttered, shifting slightly in the bed. The movement sent a twinge of pain through his side, and he winced. But I'm guessing that's an improvement. Marginal, Ilnor replied. He gestured to the holographic display. Your progress is inconsistent. While your tissue regeneration is proceeding at an acceptable rate, your circulatory system remains alarmingly fragile. I have had to improvise several treatments to compensate for the inadequacies of your physiology. Jace arched an eyebrow. Inadequacies. Ilnor tilted his head, his thoracic flaps quivering. Your species relies on a single pump the heart for all blood circulation. This is not only inefficient but dangerous. A redundant system would mitigate the risk of total systemic failure in the event of trauma. Yeah, well, we make do with what we've got, Jace said, his tone wry. Not all of us get to be built like walking life support systems. Your persistence in the face of such biological limitations continues to baffle me, Ilnor said, his voice softening slightly. Yet it is also impressive. Jace chuckled weakly. I'll take that as a compliment. Before Ilnor could respond, a loud, metallic groan reverberated through the ship. Jace tensed instinctively, his heart rate spiking as the sound echoed in the med bay. What was that, he asked, his voice sharp? Ilnor frowned, his hands moving swiftly over the console. Uncertain. I will contact the bridge for. Before he could finish, the door to the med bay slid open, and Captain Rena strode in, her expression grim. We've got a problem, she said without preamble. What kind of problem, Jace asked, his voice tight. Rena's antennae twitched. The ship passed through a debris field 3 hours ago. One of the external coolant lines was compromised, and it's leaking into the lower engine chamber. If we don't seal it soon, the entire system could overheat. Jace tried to sit up, his face twisting in pain as his body protested. You need me down there, he said, his voice strained. Absolutely not, Ilnor interjected, stepping between Jace and the captain. He is in no condition to leave this med bay, let alone perform strenuous activity. Moving him now would be tantamount to suicide. We don't have time to argue, Rena said, her tone sharp. She looked at Jace. You're the only one who knows that section of the system inside and out. If someone else goes in blind, they'll waste precious time or worse, make things worse. I can do it, Jace said, his voice firm despite the sweat beading on his brow. You most certainly cannot, Ilnor snapped. Your wound is barely stabilized. Even a minor strain could rupture the repaired tissue. Jace ignored him, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. The movement left him breathless, pain lancing through his side, but he gritted his teeth and pushed through. Jace, Rena said, her voice softening. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't critical. I know, Jace said, forcing himself to his feet. His legs wobbled, and he gripped the edge of the bed for support. That's why I'm going. This is madness, Ilnor said, his thoracic flaps vibrating furiously. Your stubbornness will cost you your life. Better my life than the whole ship, Jace said, his gaze steady. You can patch me up again when it's done, right? Ilnor hesitated, his hands twitching. Your confidence in my abilities is misplaced. Guess we'll find out, Jace said with a faint grin. With Rena's help, Jace made his way to the lower engine chamber, each step a grueling test of his endurance. By the time they reached the breach, his vision was swimming, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps. The coolant leak hissed loudly, filling the chamber with a noxious fog. Jace slipped on a respirator, his hands trembling as he activated the emergency override to access the damaged line. You've got 5 minutes before the heat levels get critical, Rena said through the comm link. Can you do it? Jace didn't answer. His focus was entirely on the task at hand, his hands working with practiced efficiency, despite the pain screaming through his body. The minutes stretched on, each second a battle against his failing strength. Just as the temperature warning began to blare, Jace finished sealing the breach and collapsed against the bulkhead, gasping for air. You did it, Rena said, her voice filled with relief. Get him back to the med bay now. Jace barely registered the words as his vision darkened. The last thing he heard was Ilnor's voice, distant but insistent. Do not let him lose consciousness. Jace woke to the now familiar hum of the med bay, his body feeling heavier than before. He blinked, his vision sluggishly clearing to reveal Ilnor standing nearby, his 4 hands moving in precise, synchronized motions as he adjusted the monitors. You, Ilnor said without looking up, are the most infuriatingly reckless being I have ever encountered. Jace let out a weak chuckle, though even that small motion sent a dull ache through his side. Good to see you too, Doc. Ilnor turned, his iridescent eyes narrowing. There is nothing good about this situation. You jeopardize not only your life but also the integrity of my work. Jace raised an eyebrow. Your work. Yes, Ilnor snapped, his thoracic flaps quivering with frustration. The hours I spent stabilizing you, sealing your wounds, and ensuring you did not succumb to your species' numerous biological flaws. All nearly undone because you decided to play hero. Someone had to fix that coolant line, Jace said, his voice hoarse but firm. If I hadn't gone, the whole ship could have been lost. Ilnor's flaps vibrated more aggressively now, a clear sign of agitation. You should have let someone else handle it. Your life is not expendable. Neither is the crew's, Jace countered. I'm the only one who knew that system well enough to repair it in time. The medic stared at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed, his hands moving to check the wound on Jace's side. Your recklessness is matched only by your resilience, Ilnor said, his tone softening slightly. Your wound reopened during the strain, but the damage was not as severe as I anticipated. You were fortunate. Not luck, Jace said, grimacing as Ilnor's hands pressed gently on his side. Just stubborn. That much is certain, Ilnor muttered, applying a fresh layer of biosealant to the wound. The door to the med bay slid open, and Captain Rena entered, her antennae twitching in a subtle display of relief as she saw Jace awake. "You're impossible, Warner," she said, stopping at his bedside. "But you pulled it off. The ship's systems are stable, and the crew's safe. You've got my thanks and my orders to stay in this med bay until Ilnor clears you." "Understood," Jace said with a small nod. Rena turned to Ilnor. "How's he doing?" "Surprisingly well," Ilnor admitted, though his tone suggested he was still annoyed. "His recovery will take time, but he appears determined to survive despite his body's many inadequacies." Jace smirked. "You keep saying that, Doc, but I'm still here." "For now," Ilnor said, though there was a faint hint of amusement in his voice. Rena shook her head, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Rest up, Warner. You've earned it." As the captain left, Jace leaned back against the pillow, exhaustion settling over him like a heavy blanket. "You know," Jace said after a moment, his voice quiet, "you keep calling humans fragile. But maybe we're just built different." Ilnor tilted his head, his thoracic flap stilling. "Different, yes, but fragile remains an accurate descriptor." "Fragile things don't survive what I've been through," Jace said, his gaze steady. "We're not unbreakable, sure, but we bend, we adapt, and we heal. That's what makes us tough." The medic regarded him silently, his iridescent eyes flickering. Finally he nodded, though his expression remained guarded. "Perhaps there is merit in your perspective. Your survival is remarkable, even if it defies logic." Jace smiled faintly. "I'll take that as a compliment." For the first time, Ilnor's lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. "You would." As the days passed, Jace's recovery continued, slow but steady. Ilnor remained vigilant, his meticulous care ensuring that the human's body healed properly despite its limitations. The medic's initial frustration gradually gave way to something resembling respect, though he still muttered about reckless humans under his breath. By the time Jace was finally cleared to leave the med bay, the two had settled into an odd but genuine camaraderie. As Jace stood at the door, leaning slightly on a crutch, he glanced back at Ilnor. "Guess this makes us even, huh?" "Even," Ilnor repeated, his tone incredulous. "You kept me alive. I saved the ship," Jace said with a grin. "Call it a draw." Ilnor's thoracic flaps quivered with exasperation, but his eyes glimmered faintly. "If this is how humans calculate equivalence, it is no wonder your species thrives in chaos." "Hey, it works," Jace said, stepping into the corridor. "Thanks, Doc, for everything." Ilnor watched him go, his expression softening as the door slid shut. "Fragile," he murmured to himself, "and yet." He turned back to the med bay, shaking his head. Impossible creatures,